There are moments in life that pass so quickly they seem almost invisible, details so small they slip through attention without resistance. And yet sometimes, those same details return later with a weight that feels impossible to ignore. That is how this story begins. Not with something obvious, not with something loud, but with something barely noticed at first. A shadow. A presence. A figure that was never meant to be the focus, yet somehow became the center of everything. It started with footage that many believed had already been fully understood. People had watched it before, some more than once, convinced that there was nothing left to discover. It showed what it needed to show, or at least that's what everyone thought. But then, someone paused at a moment that had always been overlooked. Not for long. Just enough to notice something that didn't quite belong. In the background, behind everything that seemed important, there was movement. At first it was dismissed. A trick of light. A distortion in the frame. The kind of thing that happens when cameras struggle with shadows and angles. But the more it was replayed, the harder it became to ignore. Because the movement didn't behave like light. It didn't flicker or shift randomly. It held form. It lingered. And slowly, the question began to form. Was that a person? Not clearly visible. Not defined enough to immediately confirm. But there was something about the shape, the stillness between movements, the way it seemed positioned. Not drifting, not passing through but standing. Watching. That was the part that unsettled people the most. It didn't feel like something that just happened to be there. It felt placed. Intentional. Like a presence that belonged to the moment, even if no one had acknowledged it. As more people began to look closely, the footage transformed. What was once a straightforward recording became something layered, something uncertain. Every frame started to feel heavier, every second more important. Because now, people weren't just watching what they had seen before, they were searching for what they might have missed. And the shadow remained. Not fully revealed, not fully hidden. Just there. The discussions that followed were not loud or chaotic. They were careful, almost hesitant. People didn't rush to conclusions. Instead, they leaned into the uncertainty, trying to understand what they were seeing without forcing it into something it might not be. But the longer they looked, the more difficult it became to dismiss. Because shadows don't hold shape like that. They don't pause. They don't seem to respond to the environment around them. And yet this one did. It existed in a way that felt just real enough to question, but just unclear enough to avoid certainty. And that balance, between visibility and obscurity, is what made it so powerful. Because when something is completely hidden, it's easy to ignore. And when something is completely clear, it's easy to understand. But when something exists in between, it creates tension. It forces the mind to work, to interpret, to fill in the gaps. That is where this figure lived. In the in-between. People began to replay the footage over and over again, each time noticing something slightly different. A shift in posture. A subtle change in position. The way the figure seemed to align with certain moments, almost as if it was aware of what was happening in the foreground. And that is when the story began to deepen. Because if it wasn't just a shadow, if it was something more, then it raised a question that no one could easily answer. Who was it? Not who could it be, but who was it? Because the presence didn't feel accidental. It felt like someone who was meant to be there, even if they were never acknowledged. Someone who stood just outside the focus, just beyond recognition. And that idea changed everything. Because a figure in the background is not just a detail, it's a perspective. It's a viewpoint that exists parallel to everything else, witnessing the same moment from a different position. And if that figure was real, then it means there was another pair of eyes present in that moment. Another understanding. Another version of events. But unlike everything else captured in the footage, this presence did not explain itself. It did not move forward into clarity. It remained where it was, silent, distant, and just out of reach. And that silence made it more powerful. Because the more people tried to understand it, the more it seemed to resist explanation. Not by changing, not by disappearing, but by simply existing in a way that refused to be fully defined. Some began to wonder if it had been there all along, unnoticed because no one was looking for it. Others questioned whether it had always been visible, or if something about the way the footage was being viewed now made it stand out more. But no matter how it was approached, one thing remained consistent. The figure was there. And once seen, it could not be unseen. It changed the way people felt about the footage. What was once familiar became unfamiliar. What was once clear became uncertain. And what was once complete began to feel like it was missing something. Because if there was a presence in the background, then the story was no longer just about what happened in the foreground. It became about what existed beyond it, what was watching from the edges, what was present without being acknowledged. And that is where the unease truly began to settle. Because a shadow can be ignored. But a figure cannot. Especially when it appears at a moment that already carries weight. Especially when it stands still while everything else moves. Especially when it feels like it knows something that no one else does. The footage remains the same. Nothing has changed. And yet, everything feels different. Because now, every time it is watched, there is something else to see. Something that was not meant to be the focus, but has become impossible to ignore. A presence that exists quietly, patiently, waiting in the background. Not revealing. Not disappearing. Just there. And the more people look at it, the more one question begins to rise above all others. Not what it is, but why it was there at all. And once that question settled in, why it was there at all, everything about the footage began to feel heavier. It was no longer just about spotting the figure. It became about understanding its place in the moment, its timing, its stillness, and the strange sense that it did not belong to the background as much as it appeared to. People didn't just watch the footage anymore. They studied it. Frame by frame. Second by second. Slowing it down, zooming in, adjusting brightness, trying to pull something clearer out of what refused to fully reveal itself. And with every attempt, the figure seemed to become more present. Not more visible, but more undeniable. Because even when clarity failed, the feeling didn't. There was something about the way it stood there. Not moving like someone passing by. Not shifting like a shadow cast by light. But existing, almost patiently. As if it had a reason to be there. That idea alone was enough to change the atmosphere around the entire story. Because if the figure wasn't random, then it meant something. And if it meant something, then it was connected. Connected to the moment. Connected to the environment. Connected, perhaps, to everything that followed. That's when the discussions began to shift in tone. What started as curiosity slowly turned into something deeper, something more intense. People were no longer asking if the figure was there. They were asking what it knew. Because presence implies awareness. And awareness implies understanding. And understanding changes everything. Some viewers began pointing out something even more unsettling. In certain frames, brief, almost unnoticeable, the figure didn't just stand there. It seemed to adjust. Not in a dramatic way, not enough to immediately confirm movement, but just enough to suggest that it wasn't completely still. That it might have been reacting. Watching more closely. Or perhaps, waiting. And that's where the story took on a new kind of tension. Because a static shadow can be explained. But something that appears to respond, even subtly, creates a completely different kind of unease. It suggests intention. It suggests awareness of the moment unfolding in front of it. And most importantly, it suggests that the figure was not just present, but engaged. That thought alone was enough to pull more people in. The footage began circulating again, not as something already seen, but as something newly discovered. People who had never paid attention to it before were now watching with a different mindset. Not casually, but carefully. Looking past the obvious. Searching for the hidden. And almost every time, they reached the same moment. The same frame. The same presence. And the same question. Why didn't anyone notice this before? It wasn't like the figure was completely invisible. It had always been there in the same place, within the same sequence. And yet, it had gone unnoticed for so long. Which raised another possibility. Maybe it wasn't that people couldn't see it. Maybe they just weren't looking for it. Because sometimes, the most revealing details are the ones hidden in plain sight. Not because they are concealed, but because attention is directed elsewhere. And once attention shifts, once the focus changes, those hidden details begin to emerge in ways that feel almost intentional. Like they were waiting to be seen. And that idea brought a different kind of energy to the story. Because now, it wasn't just about discovering something new. It felt like uncovering something that had been quietly present all along. Something that had been overlooked, not by accident, but by design of perception. The more people focused on the figure, the more questions began to multiply. Was it someone who had been there that night, unnoticed by others? Was it someone who chose to remain in the background, away from attention? Or was it something else entirely, something that didn't fit into any simple explanation? No answer felt complete. No explanation felt enough. Because every attempt to define the figure only led to more uncertainty. And that uncertainty became the center of everything. People began noticing how the figure's position seemed too deliberate to be random. It wasn't placed in a way that suggested coincidence. It was aligned with the scene, almost as if it had chosen that exact spot for a reason. Close enough to see. Far enough to remain hidden. That balance was what made it so unsettling. Because it felt intentional. Like a presence that understood where to stand to avoid being noticed, while still being able to observe everything clearly. And once that thought takes hold, it changes how you see the entire moment. Because now, the footage is no longer just a recording. It becomes a perspective. One that includes not just what is shown, but what is quietly watching from the edges. And that brings a deeper question into focus. If the figure was watching, what was it watching for? Moments began to feel different under that lens. Actions that once seemed ordinary now carried a sense of being observed. Pauses felt longer. Movements felt more significant. The entire scene took on a new layer of meaning, not because anything had changed, but because the presence of the figure changed how everything was interpreted. And that is where the tension truly began to settle. Because the figure never stepped forward. It never revealed itself. It never gave any indication of who, or what it was. It simply remained in the background. Watching. Existing. Holding its place in the moment as if it belonged there. And that silence, that refusal to move beyond the edges of the frame, made it more powerful than anything else in the footage. Because the unknown always carries more weight than the known. And the longer something remains unexplained, the more it begins to feel like it holds something important. Something just out of reach. Something that could change everything, if only it were understood. But it isn't. Not yet. And maybe that's what makes it so compelling. Because every time the footage is watched, the figure is still there. Unchanged. Unmoving. Unexplained. And every time, it brings the same feeling back. That something about that moment was never meant to be seen this clearly. And yet now, it cannot be ignored.